And we're back. It says we're live. Somebody jump on there and tell me if the audio is good with the live chat. Wait a minute, and then we'll get started and work our way through all the bloody questions and whatnot today. So, somebody shoot me a live chat saying that the audio's okay or not okay, whatever the case may be. Everything's good. All right, looks like things are good. Cool. And we got people logging on. I just had 15 log on in about the last 3 seconds. So, homework, I'm working my way through it. If you got an email back saying you got it, I got it, or okay or something, everything's pretty good, but I've still got about half of them that I haven't worked my way through yet. So I will be doing that. We've got a quick homework question here. When calculating the answers for the last 2 questions, do we use the number of pounds from our calculating utilization pounds or the pounds from slope adjustment? As I recall, there is no slope adjustment. You're a 0 to 2% slope, so you shouldn't be making any kind of slope adjustments. So most of you, where you're kind of jumping the track, most of you, not all of you, is in question number 2 in the water adjustment. I want to apologize for somehow or another an old version of that thing of homework got sent out, and so make sure that you're using the second email, the second corrected homework assignment, and not the first one. The second one will explain things a whole lot better. So yes, I am going to, I can let you know what your grades are. What I was thinking about doing is just going through and sending out an individual email to everybody, particularly once we get through this sequence of homeworks. Homework number 4, I'm thinking about holding back until homework number 5, but what I will do is I will send out a sequence of emails, or I will send out individual emails and I'll put down the grades that you have so far for each assignment that we've got so far. So that's how I plan to do that, and I should be able to do that early next week. If you can't wait that long, send me an email, and I will. I'll get the information to you a little quicker than next week sometime. So, okay. If you have any other housekeeping questions or anything like that, just go ahead and type them in, and I will take a look at them here as we proceed. The next. Well, that's not the correct way to say it. We've got one more homework assignment, actual homework assignment, in addition to homework number 5. This was homework number 4 due today, homework number 5 due on Monday. We have one more that'll give us 6 homeworks. That'll make up for some points that we lost for our format change. So I've got one more of those that I've got to get to you, and that will be another rhetorical presses assignment on a little short video that I will send out with the assignment as well. So it's looking, the logistics, we have 2 major projects left, and the first one, I've just about got all the logistics worked out for it. You can't just kind of do these things overnight. I'm waiting to hear from people, other people outside the university that are going to volunteer their time and their effort on this next. I'll put it this way: our first large assignment. And we've got 2 of those to come. I'm about probably maybe 85% of the way through it. I'm still waiting to hear from 2 individuals to get back to me. So hopefully I hear something from them today. and I can get this thing finalized and worked out, and maybe we can actually get things initiated maybe on Wednesday next week at the best case scenario. I think maybe Wednesday. I'll try and get that assignment out so you can get started working on that. I can't answer a lot of questions on it just yet because, like I say, some things are still sort of working their way through, and it would be easier for me to just try and explain it all at one time than give you pieces of it and so on. So, but what it's going to entail, as I've mentioned before in these lectures, is it's going to require you to make a phone call and do an interview with someone who is integral calculus, integrally associated or closely associated with the wild horse and burro challenge that we now have going on with our nation. It's gotten to the point where the entire country is starting to weigh in on it and pay attention to it, and in particular Congress, both the House and the Senate. So best case scenario, probably Wednesday next week. I'll try and get that assignment out and get it up and rolling so you can do your preliminary research and begin that and get that thing initiated. The second big project is going to be less time consuming. I'm trying to put it together now too. When you do these things and you do it online, you have to think about a lot of things that you normally don't think about. How to get it to you is pretty easy, but how to get it back to me in a format that I can look at and get graded in a reasonable amount of time, and still require you to have the kind of input that you need to have into it is kind of it's a little different than when we're going on this online thing here. So I got a question here. Is the Wild Horse and Burro meeting still occurring on the 20th? No, it is not. It has been canceled. I think I mentioned this in one of the other lectures. It has been canceled, and we have one scheduled for October. We also had a summit in Cody that we had scheduled for May, and we've moved that back to early October as well. So this coronavirus thing has really sort of pushed everything back by a number of months. And so, no, there is not going to be a horse and burro meeting here in an advisory board, Wild Horse and Burro advisory board meeting here in Reno, as was proposed and planned. In fact, we're even concerned now that we may not even have a meeting in October this year. So we will figure it out. So, okay, I'm getting some questions on homework number 5. What I'm going to do with homework number 5 is I'm going to ask you to send your questions by email, and if I can, if your specific questions, if I can answer one here while we're live, I will try to do it. But I'd have to look at this one. So send me your emails on homework number 5, specific things. Send it to me by email, and I'll see if I can. I'll try and get that answered by email. So, okay. I think that's all the housekeeping that we need to take care of this morning. And so, we're 2 weeks into this experiment. There's some pros and cons to it. I think it's going to be, universities, brick and mortar universities, this is just my opinion, and I've been saying this for a number of years. I think brick and mortar universities, when it comes to like basic courses like English and basic math and some of the other really basic classes, they can be done online. And brick and mortar universities are headed, with respect to those kinds of things, are really sort of headed to the graveyard. And I think this is going to actually push it even farther. Uh, why should you, the question that you've been asking, right, is why should you come and live on a campus and pay rent, extra rent, or pay dorm fees and all that kind of stuff to go live on a campus, to go to take a basic English class when you could do it online and do it just as well. So some of those questions are being considered pretty heavily across the United States right now this morning. So this thing, I think, is going to actually precipitate some changes that were in the offing and ready to go anyway. So, okie doke. Let's talk a little bit more about wildlife habitat this morning in the time that we got left. It's Friday. I guess we all won't be going out for pizza and beer tonight. We might be staying in for pizza and beer, but things at least have changed in the short term. So let's talk about some wildlife stuff. We finished up, the last thing that we talked about on Wednesday was that habitat is not a discrete location on the Earth's surface. And there are a lot of wildlife managers, to be quite honest, that think that it is. And let me give you an example of that. Let's take the greater sage grouse, which has been an issue here in Nevada and throughout the West for almost 20 years. And it has finally come to sort of been sorted out to some degree anyway. In fact, the good news this week is that the bi-state sage grouse subspecies plan, or the bi-state sage grouse has been taken off the threatened endangered species list because of a lot of conservation efforts that have been going on down in the Carson City, Bridgeport area. And so that's fantastic news. A lot of conservation groups got together, created a great plan, and Fish and Wildlife Service said, "Hey, this plan looks good, so we're not gonna keep the bird on the list." Essentially, so that was great news. I haven't seen all the particulars of it, had time to look at all the particulars, but it seems as though that's where we're progressing anyway with the bi-state bird. But the greater sage grouse, in a larger context, here we have some habitat requirements, some seasonal habitat requirements for this particular bird. Now, we have winter range that the bird needs, and the bird uses sagebrush in the wintertime, almost exclusively sagebrush in parts of the wintertime. Basically this bird has giant cecums, and two giant cecums, and it basically digests a lot of fiber as a non-ruminant animal. And so it uses sagebrush during the wintertime. There's nothing else green growing. There's no insects. And so they are limited to sagebrush. And oftentimes sagebrush is the only forage that is sticking up above the snow line in lots of places like northern Nevada, for instance. So this bird, it doesn't have a muscular gizzard that grinds seeds up like a lot of other birds do. If it pecked rocks and ground up sagebrush leaves, it would release a lot of terpenes that would kill its rumen flora. And if it's it's cecum flora, cecum flora, it would kill a lot of cecum flora, and it wouldn't be able to digest fiber in the wintertime. And so it's a very unique and interesting bird. It's a big bird, big gallinaceous bird. If you've never seen it, you can Google up a picture of it. But it's been on the forefront of a tremendous effort in the state of Nevada and other states across the West over the last 15 to 20 years, depending on when you want to start the clock. And so anyway, the sage grouse needs winter range. So it needs sagebrush in the winter. Then it needs lecking habitat. These are these flat areas where sagebrush, some people call them booming grounds, but they're lecking grounds where they mate. And it's a certain type of habitat structure that's needed. Not a lot of sage grouse sagebrush cover. It's mostly just sort of open ground in the middle of larger sagebrush cover. And then we need nesting habitat. They move from these more open areas into areas that have, at least it's been determined, they really like about 20 to 25% sagebrush cover. Depending on whose paper you're looking at, sometimes it's a little bit less than that. So 15 to 20%, somewhere in that range, somewhere around 20% cover, sagebrush cover, and they also need understory grasses and forbs during this nesting season. Now, once the chicks hatch, they need bugs. If they don't get bugs, a big protein source of bugs within the first 4 days or so, give or take, then nesting success or chick survival is really dramatically decreases. And so during that part of the year, they're in the spring, they're eating those really neat, nice little buds that are coming up on the forbs, the blooms and little green leaves, and ants and other bugs that are around in the area. And as the spring fades into summer and moves into late season summer habitat, late season brood habitat, they need sub-irrigated meadows and meadows along riparian streams and such. And so there's seasonal habitats that are needed. And each one of these habitats have particular characteristics that the birds prefer. It's their preferred habitat characteristics that we have to take a look at when we're talking about management. Well, here's what we know about sagebrush plant communities. Once sagebrush plant communities, and we were pioneering this in Wyoming back in the mid 1990s. What we know is that when you get to about 12 or 15% sagebrush cover, the understory begins to be affected. The grasses and the forbs begin to be affected because of the competition. The sagebrush can outcompete the understory for nutrients and for water and so forth. And sometimes there's shading involved as well. And so once you get to about 12 or 15% sagebrush cover, the understory starts to decline in its habitat quality that it would provide for early season brood habitat, as an example. So what do we do? So what was proposed? What initially was proposed is that the birds prefer this 20 to 25% sagebrush cover. Well, once you get to 20 to 25% sagebrush cover, your understory is already in a state of decline. And once you go over 25% sagebrush cover, it really declines. It gets to a point that if it's protected from fire, and you do get up to that 35% sagebrush cover, and I've seen it as high as 40%. And then when it gets that high, the antelope walk around it. You can't walk through the stuff. Once it gets to that point, the understory is it's in such a state of decline that it's just almost not there. And so the habitat quality for the bird is then compromised. And so when wildlife management agencies were calling for 25% sagebrush cover and a certain amount of understory height of cover or production, those two things are mutually exclusive. You can't have more elk and more aspen, as an example. You just can't do it. And so there's this play back and forth between wildlife management agencies and habitat ecologists with rangeland backgrounds. The rangeland folks are telling them, look, if you're going to do this, you can't just build a fence, a wall around a bunch of sagebrush and try to protect it from fire. Because if you do, what's going to happen? Let's say we build a big wall around 10,000 acres of really, really great late season brood habitat for sage grouse. Let's just pretend that we do that. And we try and protect that 10,000 acres of late season brood habitat from fire and other disturbances. What's going to happen in 20 years? That plant community is going to change, and that sagebrush cover is going to increase, and it's going to, punch up to that 25-30% range, maybe even higher. And so the quality of that particular piece of habitat as late season brood habitat is going to decline because the understory is going to decline. Okay? And so protecting this sagebrush in mass on millions of acres and without doing any kind of management intrusion like prescribed burns or using some type of herbicide. In some cases, spike works pretty well. It worked pretty well in Wyoming. To go in and thin that sagebrush every now and again, where we have control of the thinning process, as opposed to Mother Nature that just wants to go burn, 500,000 acres, makes sense. And yet we had one agency, wildlife management agencies in most cases, saying, no, we can't touch it, while we had range ecologists, on the other hand, saying if you don't touch it, it's going to decline in its quality. And so what you have to do is move habitat, seasonal habitats, and their quality around on the landscape. As long as there is some of it around in a landscape, the birds will find it, other critters will find it, and everything will be, pretty much okay. But if you just try to protect it in perpetuity, you're only going to get it to the point where the fuel is going to build up, the sagebrush fuel is going to build up, and it's going to be a massive fire, and you're going to lose it all. And so that's why I say, and that's why it's important to understand, extremely important to understand, that habitat is not a discrete location on the landscape. Because what is great late season brood habitat today, or what is great winter habitat today, or great feed ground habitat today, 20 years from now, if it's not managed appropriately, it will be lousy of that kind of habitat, whatever we're talking about, seasonal habitat. It will be lousy seasonal habitat for that season in the future, simply because, remember back to the first of the semester, plant communities change over time. Even if we just sit back and passively manage it and don't try to intervene into the disturbance process, plant communities change. And we have to be cognizant of that, or we run into trouble. We run ourselves into trouble. Now, this concept of managers intervening into the successional process its foundation is really in what we call the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And basically, in a nutshell, what the intermediate disturbance hypothesis means in terms of management is if you periodically, in an intermediate amount of time, whatever that might be, disturb an area, disturb a piece of habitat, disturb a piece of rangeland with something like fire, prescribed fire, or reseeding, or the use of herbicides, or the use of biocontrols for invasive species. If you intervene during an intermediate amount of time with an intermediate form, not an extreme form, but an intermediate form of disturbance, then your landscape is going to be more diverse. There's going to be more diversity. If you go into it, let's say you take a 10,000 10,000 acre piece of rangelands, and you go in and you decide you're going to burn 20% of it uh, every 5 years or every 10 years, pick your number. What you're going to have at the end of that cycle is you're going to have different age classes of shrubs. You're going to have different amounts of forbs. You're going to have different concentrations and amounts of grasses and grass species, all scattered over that 10,000 acre area. Whereas if you just went you went on a 30-year burn cycle and you just burned it all off on 30, at the end of every 30 years, then everything is going to be the same. And that's essentially what we've been doing for the last 40 years in the Intermountain West. Robin Tausch talks about it like this: we had the Pleistocene, and we had the Holocene, and now we're in the Homogocene. Basically, the way that a lot of land has been managed over the last 50 years is to make it all homogeneous. We want it to be all sagebrush and nothing else. Just all sagebrush with no pockets of no sagebrush or of less sagebrush. And so what that does is that creates a homogeneous landscape, which plays into this whole idea of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which has positive effects on diversity and on species richness on the landscape. Now, I've got some stuff here on your handout that is extremely important to understand, to get a picture of this. I'll just read it to you. Or we can read it together, one or the other. Some species require different seasonal habitats. Sage grouse is a great example of that. Plant community composition or diversity is dynamic. It's controlled by climate, disturbances, and different intensities of disturbances. And so rangeland management and grazing management can promote diversity or eliminate diversity depending on the application. All right? Livestock grazing effects on wildlife habitat can be basically divided into two large units: direct effects and indirect effects. We're going to come back to this livestock grazing as a disturbance process. And keep in mind that we have this intermediate disturbance hypothesis in the back of our minds. So we're going to talk about this point a little bit more here when we get into indirect impacts. I want to jump to direct impacts first, and we're going to talk about indirect impacts. So, direct impacts. What are some direct impacts that we can expect when we talk about livestock and wildlife? Maybe in particular big game animals, not necessarily big game animals, but livestock grazing can have direct effects. Obviously, if livestock are out here grazing off all of the forage, and then suddenly a wildlife species that needs that particular area for a very important seasonal habitat, once they get there, if there's nothing to eat, that would be a direct impact. And we're seeing the reciprocal, well, not reciprocal, we're seeing a great example of that in Nevada now with sage grouse and wild horses and burros. We have wild horses and burros that are really doing a lot of habitat damage to some of this late season brood habitat for sage grouse and other critters, not just sage grouse. Typically in Nevada, we're really short on late season summer habitat. And wild horses and burros, if they get into an area like that and they just cause degradation, then when the wildlife species shows up and there's nothing there for them to eat, that's a direct impact. It directly affects the animal in using that. There's no cover there. If they need cover, there's no forage as well. And so direct impacts can be positive or negative. In that case, that would be a negative impact. It just depends on the requirement of the species at any given locale. an effect may be very beneficial to one species, it may be devastating to another species. We're gonna look at take a quick look at the Serengeti Mara system here, probably week after next. That'll show a beneficial direct impact in the Serengeti Mara system in East Africa. Um, Indirect impacts are quite often they're not really all that well understood. Indirect impacts between livestock uh, and wildlife species. Uh, but one of the most common ones that we can talk about is this idea of changing through livestock grazing management. You can change for better or for worse the plant community composition that wildlife would use or not use. And so that would be an indirect effect. If we grazed an area, for instance, in Nevada, if we grazed it with livestock for 40 years, only livestock, cattle, I should say, if we grazed it with cattle for 40 years, we would expect the plant community, because of the diet preferences of the cattle. Remember diet preferences all the way back in the before time here? Diet preferences of cattle, because of the diet preferences of cattle, they can shift the composition of the plant community. And they can shift it toward browse because they're putting all their grazing pressure on the herbaceous component. The browse species are not getting utilized, and so they have a competitive advantage. The browse species would in that case. And so if you're a browse species, that's great. If you're a wildlife species that's a browser, then that's fantastic. But if you're a grazer, a wildlife species that's a grazer, that may be not so good for you. Now, if we took that same area and we grazed that same area for 40 years with sheep, we're likely to see a different response in the plant community. We might see less of a dominance of browse species. And so, depending on what you are as a species and whether you prefer to graze or browse, sheep could actually manipulate the plant community in a way that would be beneficial or negative as well. So we can do that. That's kind of an indirect effect. We can also do this, just little things. So let's say we have a 30,000 acre pasture, and every year for 40 years we turn out in the same corner of that plant community. What would you expect? Well, not knowing anything about plant communities, you would expect the plant community composition and quality in that corner where you turn out, where you first turn the animals out during the grazing season. You would expect that to be different than the plant community composition and quality on the other end of the pasture in the opposite corner. Because the animals would graze from this corner where you turn them out, and if they're out there for 3 months, it may take them 3 months to get all the way to the other end of the corner. And so they're grazing different seasonalities of the same, in some cases, the same forage species. But grazing them at different seasonalities can create different patches on the landscape of quality and plant composition. So just a simple little thing like that, where you don't turn your livestock out in the same corner every year for 40 years, can make a huge difference in habitat characteristics. So indirect effects, they're not as easily measured. But there's some really important stuff here towards the halfway into this paragraph on indirect impacts. And let's just read it together here. On rangelands, as plant community decreases, as plant diversity decreases, wild animals lose the ability to select diets that will meet their physiological demands. As selectivity decreases, so does nutritional quality, and subsequently production and health. Let me give you an example of that with humans. The economically distressed or the economically poor in the United States generally have uh, less access to more diverse diets. Okay? The economically poor or the economically distressed in the United States generally have a decreased access uh, to more diverse diets. Or you can just say it the opposite way, they have less diverse diets. So if you're economically, if you are economically stressed, you're not as likely to go buy a ribeye steak. You're more likely to go to McDonald's and get one of their, delicious, nutritious hamburgers. Some of the poor, uh, economically distressed in the United States, are on federal assistance, and so they have a card that's accepted in certain places for food, and they might use that card. Because McDonald's is a cheap source of carbohydrates and energy. Some people in the country, on those lower economic scales, may eat at McDonald's a dozen times a week. And in large part, it's due to their economic situation. Okay? Now, hopefully that makes sense to you. If when selectivity, the ability to select a diverse diet for whatever reason, whether it's just not there or whether economically it's not feasible in the case of human beings, when the ability to have a less, or when selectivity decreases, the sustainability of a population decreases. So we like to make sure that we've got diverse landscapes. And when we're talking about wild animals, rangelands, we want to have diverse landscapes. And we can do that through the grazing process and through the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. We make sure that the processes are working on the landscape. The plant communities will sort of take care of themselves. If we remove fire from a system, completely remove fire from a system, we're going to cause that system to adapt to that, and it may become less useful as certain types of wildlife habitat. If we introduce too much fire, as an example, into some of these ecosystems in the western United States, then that also can cause a change in diversity. It can make everything be more homogeneous. And so the more homogeneous it is, the less diverse it is. The less diverse it is, the less selectivity that wild animals have. And so it endangers our wildlife populations. So these indirect effects are hard to measure quantifiably in many cases, but they are there all nonetheless, and they are very, very important. And we have to pay attention to those things. Okay, now that I've confused you with that enough, let's talk about social interaction. Some wildlife species have aversions to domestic livestock. Others, they love them. Cattle egrets. You get into where the cattle egret areas in the southern United States, the cattle egrets are you might have a half a dozen of them standing up on the back of a cow, picking flies off the cow. So they obviously don't have any social aversions to cattle, that particular species anyway. Some wildlife species, like moose, elk, bighorn sheep, whitetail, mule deer, at times they just prefer not to be around cattle or sheep. There are times, just different times of the year. Maybe in some cases it might be during calving season for elk, or fawning season for deer, In the wintertime, seems like there's not usually that much aversion, but and sometimes of the year they just prefer not to be near domestic cattle. Antelope, I've never seen antelope really be adverse to domestic cattle at any time. I suppose there's some conditions where there might be. Uh, but we really don't know a whole lot about small mammals, if there's any aversion there at all. Some birds may be adverse to domestic cattle. It's really hard in some cases. We just don't know. We also know that there are aversions between one wildlife species and another wildlife species. There's cases of that. Uh, Barred owls and spotted owls. You guys are not old enough to remember the spotted owl controversy, but we shut down almost all of the mom and pop logging industry in the Pacific Northwest because of the spotted owl. And as it turns out, the spotted owl didn't care. The spotted owl just didn't like barred owls. And we know that now, but we shut down an entire industry on the West Coast uh, in order to save the spotted owl. And it turns out it was just the barred owl, and the spotted owls didn't like them. They have an aversion to them. They don't want to be around them. And so we can have aversions between one wildlife species and another wildlife species. We don't know a lot about them, but it does occur. We talked about disease transmission. Dr. Teglis talked to you about disease transmission. I'm not going to get into that at this point, but I do want to talk a little bit about physical operations here before we wind up at the end of the period here. Physical things that we do in ranching operations often affect wildlife, and our physical operations can affect wildlife in positive and negative ways. And we have to be cognizant that when we put up a barn, we may have an effect. We may have a direct effect. We may have an indirect effect on wildlife species just when we put up a new barn, for instance. Or when we go and buy a ranchette, we go and buy 5 acres somewhere, and we put up a house and a shop and a barn. That may have some effect on wildlife species. And when you look at that in a collective nature, take the North Valleys here in Reno. When I moved here 20 years ago, there was nothing out there. Now there's all kinds of housing developments. There's the big Walmart store, the mall. It's just incredible what's out there, and that had an effect on some sage-grouse leks out there. It had an effect on other wildlife species. And so just the physical things that we do, physical operations that we do on ranches can have positive and negative effects that may have to be mitigated. In some cases, maybe they don't need to be mitigated, but in other cases, they do need to be mitigated. And probably the biggest physical operation thing that can be problematic for wildlife species, particularly big game species, and in some cases for flying species, are fences. Fences, particularly when we put together and we put up what's called sheep-type fences. Sheep-tight fences. In other words, a fence that's tight enough to keep a sheep, a ewe, or a lamb captive inside an area, okay, or outside an area. So they're called sheep-tight fences. That's just sort of the common colloquial name for it. It takes a different fence to keep sheep than it does to keep cattle, a different type of fence. And so when we build sheep-tight fences, we have wildlife species like pronghorn antelope as a great example, the primary example. Deer will jump a fence. Elk will jump a fence. They'll tear the fence down, but they'll jump it. And deer will jump a fence, no problem. wildlife or pronghorn antelope undoubtedly have the ability to jump fences as well. I've seen 2 million antelope in my life all over the Intermountain West, and I've seen them jump a fence 3 times. Antelope crawl under it. That's what they prefer to do. They'll crawl through it if they have to, but they prefer to crawl under fences. And sheep tight fences prohibit this. And the best example that I have am aware of uh, where this became a huge problem was in the winter of 1983, 1984, which was that was the last winter that we've had. I mean, serious winter that we've had in the Intermountain West. And there was a fence. It's called the Lawrence fence. That was put up across a big area in the Red Desert of Wyoming. Um, and they put up 28 miles of fence on some private ground, on some checkerboard ground. 28 miles of sheep tight fence. And in the winter of 1983-84, it's estimated, and it's a pretty good estimate. It's a conservative estimate. 8,000 antelope starved or froze to death up against that fence that winter because they couldn't move. They put this fence across a traditional migration corridor, and they came up against the fence. It was a bad winter. They couldn't move, and they froze to death or they starved to death. 8,000 antelope along one section of fence. And it was so controversial that the state of Wyoming and Fish and Wildlife got together with some private entities and other ranchers in the area, and they removed that fence. They pulled up about 8 miles of the fence. They left it as sort of as a drift fence for cattle and sheep, and they opened up 8 miles of it so the antelope could move through that area if we had a bad winter again. That winter was so bad that there were no antelope in Craig, Colorado before that winter. And the antelope from there north of Baggs in Wyoming, in that area, they moved about 150 miles. They migrated 150 miles south and created a permanent herd on the mountain there outside of Craig, Colorado. So we still see these massive movements occasionally around the western United States with big game animals. And so I think the Fish and Game actually have now purchased that area, or at least parts of that area where the Lawrence fence was, so they have guaranteed that fencing will never be put up in that at least those 8 miles where it was pulled up ever again. So a very, very serious situation where a direct impact occurred based on physical operations of a ranch, and so those things can happen, and when they do, they can be very, very, very problematic. So, okay, I'm going to wind it up here today. As soon as I get done here, I'm going to start going through your homework 4s. If you want to go ahead and send your homework 5s in like you did. So a lot of you did. Send it in early. I'll take a quick peek at it, and if there's problems, I'll send it back and let you take another look at it again. So we're going to try and get all these homeworks wound up so everybody's good on them, and we will move forward from that. So that's what I'm going to do. Unless you have some questions here for the live chat, shoot them to me here real quick. Otherwise, I'm gonna sign off and start delving into the homework pretty hard here this morning to try and get it all buttoned up. So, live chat questions. Other than homework. Okie dokie. Nothing's coming over the wire. So you guys have a great weekend. Try and stay healthy, and I think we get another week behind us in this whole mess. Certainly 2 weeks. We're going to know a whole lot more about what we can do and when things can change with respect to our daily habits and whatnot. So if we can get through another week, maybe 2 weeks, we'll know more. We'll be able to see into the future a little bit better, I think. So, okay, have a great weekend, and we will see you again on Monday. Take care.